Hi everybody, welcome to our week 4 lecture for World Religions and Global Issues, and also our final lecture for our summer class here at CSU Chico. So, as we move into our final lectures and readings for this week, we're looking at 4 main articles: Pandemic Politics in South Asia, Muslims and Democracy by Matt Nelson, Viral Fundamentals, Riding the Corona Waves in India by Banu Subramaniam, Donald Trump, the Christian Right and COVID-19, The Politics of Religious Freedom by Jeffrey Haynes, and Saving the Economy, Liberty, and Yourself, Christian Nationalism and America's Views on Government COVID-19 Restrictions by Samuel Perry, Andrew Whitehead, and Joshua Grubbs. So again, start out with sort of a big picture story here. In our readings this week, we looked at sort of how the impacts of this global coronavirus pandemic have played out in different parts of the world, and particularly in relation to different religious traditions. And as we saw in our first set of readings focused on South Asia, our author there argues that the global pandemic has given a boost, unfortunately, to authoritarian regimes and authoritarian politics. And we're often seeing emergency powers being invoked under the name of public health or quarantine-related measures, but having the result of suppressing both public dissent and forms of government criticism. Now, as our ongoing dive into Hindu nationalism, which we've looked at a bit over the last 2 weeks, and Hindutva ideologies in India has shown, unfortunately, religious nationalism there also continues to play an important role in both the targeting of religious minorities and ethnic minorities, particularly Muslims, and also those who are most vulnerable to the COVID-19 outbreak, in part because they have limited access to medical resources and staffing, which, as our authors note, is leading to not only further demonization, but also the ghettoization under the guise of quarantine politics. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that works. And we also see from our author the way in which Vedic sciences in India are being sort of abused and used by political figures, Prime Minister Modi and many others, Hindu yogi Baba Ramdev, to promote a whole range of bogus health claims that relate to COVID-19, either alternative cures or supposed treatments to help deal with that, none of which, as our authors note, have any documented medical basis, but rather draw their legitimacy from this kind of broad Hindu cultural influences in India. And then finally, in our last set of articles, we're looking at religion and pandemic politics here in the United States, and particularly, as we see in these 2 articles, the role of nationalism and Christian nationalism in influencing debates over COVID-19, and focusing on these issues of personal liberty and religious freedom, in particular, personal liberty and religious freedom from secular government intervention. And as we've seen these most recent debates over the past year and a half around COVID-19, are part of this sort of longer, broader history of the Christian right and political engagements with the government, and questioning the legitimacy of secular authority, particularly when it comes to matters of religion and individual choice, let's say. So that's kind of the big picture of what we're talking about this week in our articles. So in this first article, Pandemic Politics in South Asia by Matt Nelson, we started to get a bit of a cross-sectional overview in 4 different regions and countries, looking at how the pandemic is playing out. And as he argues, unfortunately, what we're seeing is the emergence of not really a new trend, but rather an intensification of the existing dynamics in India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and the contested region of Kashmir and Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh in northwest India. And in this sense, he argues, it has altered the political landscape as much as climate change has altered our weather, introducing more intense versions of familiar challenges, for example, stronger hurricanes of Hindu majoritarianism and Muslim marginalization in India, longer droughts restricting civil liberties on the Indian side of Kashmir, more expansive floods of anti-state protests in Pakistan, and hotter fires of religious authoritarianism in Afghanistan. So he argues that COVID-19 debates have really sort of revolved around, not just in South Asia, but more globally, debates about kind of 2 competing political regime types, which he describes as authoritarian, with more of a greater focus on sort of bureaucratic capacity. So China might be a classic example of this, versus democratic regimes with a greater focus on electoral legitimacy, and at least we like to think the United States would be an example of that. Now, as Nelson notes about these democratic states, in particular, the patterns of legitimacy are often mediated by these different entrenched social divisions, and this is certainly true in India as well, with electoral legitimacy varying dramatically across different social groups. So these forms of pattern social exclusion create what he describes as segmented patterns of legitimacy, and then that results in uneven patterns of state capacity and effectiveness. And so we see these various segmented social cleavages in the readings we've been doing for the last couple weeks, particularly around religious divisions. So we can think about last week our discussion, well, 2 weeks ago now, week 2, about the 2002 Gujarat massacres between Hindus and Muslims as a good example of the way that these segmented social cleavages are playing out. Now, Nelson also looks at the kind of political responses to COVID-19 in these 4 different countries and concludes that ultimately COVID-19 is acting as a force multiplier, basically accelerating these anti-democratic trends that he says are already present and shaping the region. So, for example, in India, he argues that both the enforcement and the containment strategies around in response to COVID-19 have largely been shaped and determined by Hindu nationalist politics and the underlying political philosophy of Hindutva. For example, he describes the way that the Deobandi Sunni Muslim group, the Tablighi Jamaat or TJ, became a target of government COVID-19 restrictions using the sort of government of India using these outdated British colonial laws like the Epidemic Diseases Act, which goes all the way back to 1897, which allowed at the time, and still since it's on the books in India, the government to impose mandatory quarantines and have those policies have then been used by the Indian government to target Muslim and other minority communities in India. And as we've seen, this selective targeting of Muslim communities by Hindu political leaders has taken place in a number of ways, for example, referring to Muslims as human bombs in social media and in other sort of press statements, and using other divisive language to target Muslims in India. I mean, as Nelson notes, these patterns of demonization, indeed overt securitization, he argues, were not limited to just BJP statements targeting the TJ, for example. Other examples he highlights include Twitter hashtags like Corona Jihad and terms like Corona terrorism attached to Muslims in India. So as he argues, in India, the ruling party's response to the pandemic built on these existing social cleavages in ways that unfortunately reinforced this segmented approach to state legitimacy. And he argues, in fact, India's selective application of the existing laws, such as the 1897 Epidemic Diseases Act, actually challenged the formal underpinnings of liberal democracy by setting out these kind of differential treatments for different religious communities within India. In the case of Kashmir, which you can see there on the right in this map picture, is a Muslim majority, sort of Muslim-dominated area of India that has been the center of debates over political autonomy and independence struggles for a number of years now. And the most recent COVID-19 sort of enforcement laws and policies have built on a few years, 2018, 2019 in particular, of exclusions from the state government in Delhi, sort of the national government, against sort of local political autonomy. So some of these that he mentions which are important are the sweeping curfews that were put into place by the Modi government, both before the current COVID outbreak and throughout in different periods. Important 2019 amendment to Article 367, which effectively disbanded the Kashmiri Constituent Assembly. So the Constituent Assembly basically would have been the political body that would have drafted what could have been an independent constitution for that state, or if it had broken away as an independent country. So that sort of short-circuited that political possibility. Indian government also invoked Article 370, which allowed them to further undermine local Kashmir political parties' self-rule and autonomy by effectively giving the president and the sort of Modi government in sort of national center politics more influence and control over local Kashmir politics. We saw this also with the 2019 Parliament redefining Kashmir as 2 new union territories. So no longer this sort of large contested area of Jammu and Kashmir, but now Jammu and Kashmir as one state and Ladakh as a second independent state, but both union territories, so both falling under the broader jurisdiction of Indian national government. And also examples such as Parliament removing various rules that had in the past prevented outsiders from owning land and restricting other foreign work and such access to what had historically been Kashmiri community residents. So all of these new changes have taken place in the last couple of years and have accelerated these dynamics under the course of COVID. You can see one example of why these might matter. So on the left, you can see the map of the proposed breakup of Jammu and Kashmir in kind of the red and Ladakh in the yellow on the right. And why that's important is if you look at the map on the right, you can see that red dividing line is roughly where the two states have now been created by this partition. And what you see is that a large portion of that sort of south and southwestern Jammu is majority Muslim or heavily heavily Hindu. Whereas a big chunk of both Jammu and Kashmir historically have been Muslim dominated, but by sort of cutting off what is mostly or largely a Buddhist area into Ladakh in the east, and congregating sort of Muslim Hindus just in the state of Jammu and Kashmir, and these new restrictions being lifted that allow for more Muslim migrants to come in, to buy property, to take over businesses. What you'll see is a slow transition where much of that area that's green, representing Muslim majority, either 50 to 90%, will increasingly become more blue as a Hindu majority grows there. So it's another sort of clever strategy by Hindu nationalists to take over even more state territory and state areas. Now, in addition to these various efforts to undermine Kashmir autonomy and impose these various Hindu nationalist politics, we also hear from Nelson about non-BJP politicians. Remember that BJP is the ruling Hindu nationalist party. So non-Hindu, non-BJP politicians being arrested, communications blackout being imposed, and even internet access being restricted or entirely shut down at times, so that what's happening in Kashmir can't be communicated to the rest of the world. So as Nelson argues, in short, the state was placed under a type of siege for nearly 6 months until a Supreme Court review led most restrictions to be lifted. But not long after that, thanks to the outbreak of COVID in 2020, Modi government reimposed many of those policies under, so in the past, maybe they had been under the guise of public order. Now they are being reimposed under the guise of public health measures. So these include, for example, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act of 1967, as well as the Jammu and Kashmir Public Safety Act of 1978, both of which grant the central government and sort of police and law enforcement broad powers to arrest and detain people, and just essentially disrupted the normal rules of political operations and restricting local political decision-making in those cases. So as Nelson argues, it would be difficult to describe a more dramatic escalation of Muslim marginalization under the cover of COVID-19. When distinguished, the experience of Kashmir, however, was not merely the segmented marginalization and securitization of Muslims, but the use of legal provisions that explicitly suspended democratic norms in order to deal with an emergency. Provisions that might have been expected to expire were it not for COVID-19, which simply placed public order restrictions into a new public health legal envelope. So it's again that using essentially emergency powers, but abusing them in this sort of context. Now, if we look just a little bit further to the west in Pakistan, Nelson sees a different but related dynamic there, where we're seeing more interreligious discrimination taking place in response to COVID. So here we're seeing the majority Sunni Deobandi leaders referring to COVID-19 as a Shia virus. So you see here the Sunni Shia split within the larger kind of Islamic community playing out. And, for example, Shia Muslims and Shia pilgrims, for example, coming back from Qom and Iran or other places on pilgrimage, being blamed for essentially bringing the virus back into Pakistan. Now, what is a little bit different in the case of Pakistan, Nelson argues, is that the Muslim political groups here, because they're already in a Muslim majority country, are essentially mobilizing against these various state government COVID restrictions to try to assert their own religious autonomy against the state. So as he argues, repeating a familiar line amongst the religious leaders who claim that God, not government, is their primary source of protection, prominent Sunni clerics insisted that faith alone was powerful prophylactic against the virus. They argued that government intervention was not merely unnecessary but objectionable, with government antivirus measures being framed as a conspiracy led by anti-Muslim foreign governments to weaken Pakistan and undermine the power of Islam. The pandemic was recast as another platform for religious elites to compete with state-sanctioned secular elites in a push to define the parameters of popular legitimacy. So again, we see similar dynamics playing out there as we've seen in other countries, including here, where the opposition would have been not to mosque closures, but let's say to churches and houses of worship. Now here we see two kind of themes that we've been discussing already in earlier weeks, kind of returning again. And one being the religious claim from religious leaders that essentially their faith makes them immune to the pandemic. And secondarily, that faith leaders are asserting their religious authority as being superior to or more legitimate than secular government authority. So again, we see this bigger story that Jürgensmeyer talked about in week one, about this growing tension between religious and secular sort of states and sources of authority and legitimacy. Now, these issues were really highlighted over protests against mosque closures and other religious restrictions in Pakistan, as well as in Kashmir as well, which led governments to renegotiate mosque closures around Ramadan, in the case of Pakistan in particular, because of concerns about violence from the Tehrik-i-Taliban and the TPP, which was a group of militants that had emerged in earlier years in response to earlier political conflicts there in Pakistan and kind of religious state disagreements. And these concerns also led, for example, the Pakistan Army to press the government to enact Article 245, which, similar to some of the articles invoked in Kashmir by India, would essentially grant the police and military much broader powers to detain and arrest people with little oversight. So, as Nelson argues, as in India and again in Kashmir, Pakistan's approach to the COVID-19 pandemic combined already existing patterns of marginalization with enduring patterns of resistance to state-based assimilation or encroachment. And as in Kashmir, Pakistan opted to reject familiar democratic norms, including fundamental rights, in favor of these emergency powers and emergency provisions. Now, if we go a little bit further to the west, the case of Afghanistan, Nelson argues that one of the most important factors remains the ongoing hostilities between the Afghan government and the Taliban militias. And as he points out, the government and Taliban efforts to delegitimize each other has significantly reduced public health responses by the state, largely because medical doctors and medical care and even vaccinations have become kind of weaponized or politicized by both Taliban militants and the Afghan state, sort of as tools to undermine each other's legitimacy. Now, one important note is that in Afghanistan, Taliban leaders and Muslim clerics by and large did sort of take the threat of COVID-19 seriously. And although it wasn't always consistent or regular, there were a number of examples where, for example, if there had been an outbreak in an area, the Taliban would cease their sort of military engagements in that region. And both the National Ulema Council and the Ulema High Commission issued fatwas, or kind of religious edicts, that said that mosques should be closed in Afghanistan in order to prevent the spread of the virus. So, as Nelson argues, that a more effective anti-pandemic response unfortunately was still thwarted by these segmented forms of state legitimacy and the restricted form of state capacity which was associated with these different enduring social divisions. In short, a pandemic was not enough to bridge the most important social and political cleavages. On the contrary, in Afghanistan, the pandemic reinforced these cleavages and bolstered the Taliban's efforts to delegitimize the Afghan democratic government. So what all this suggests for Nelson is that in the context of these South Asian countries, but we could argue in a more broader context outside of just South Asia, these legitimacy gaps associated with these various entrenched social and political cleavages involving Muslims or other groups of Muslims that have shaped state efforts to address the global COVID-19 pandemic have a certain pattern. And that pattern that's prevailed across all of these cases that Nelson looked at is of one, of pushing away the legitimacy of elected governments and a further push away from democratic norms. So Nelson argues that there's a persistent risk that COVID-19 analysts will focus on state capacity more than segmented legitimacy, inadvertently supporting either two things. One is this kind of first Chinese model of bureaucratic state capacity and sort of the biosurveillance that's gone along with it, or B, a kind of anti-democratic model focused on these use of emergency powers and public health measures, rather than really addressing these problems. And he worries that this shift may help elected leaders defeat the virus, but in the end, what they'll realize is that they're actually killing their democracies in the process. And as he noted earlier, he sees these efforts in India and Kashmir and Pakistan and Afghanistan as part of a broader wave of anti-democratic and authoritarian politics that are appearing in many parts of the world under these sort of COVID-19 pressures, and that would include places like the United States and much of Europe. Now, in our second article, Viral Fundamentals, Riding the Corona Waves in India by Banu Subramaniam, we delve a little bit more again into this question of Hindu nationalism and how it's playing out in India. And she particularly brings up another aspect we haven't looked as much at in the past, which is the links between Hindu nationalism and science and medicine within India, which she argues COVID-19 has really brought to the fore, and particularly highlighting the role and the power of the BJP and these Hindutva ideologies in shaping these debates. So Subramaniam argues there's a powerful campaign within India and outside to rewrite the history books and tell a new story of India, its past, present, and future. Hindu nationalists have selectively and strategically used rhetoric from both science and Hinduism, modernity and orthodoxy, Western and Eastern thought, to build a powerful but potentially dangerous vision of India as a Hindu nation. And at the heart of Hindu nationalism is not only a mythological but an imagined mythico-scientific corpus, where Hindu mythology and modern science melt seamlessly into the other. One of the sort of best examples of this that Subramaniam talks about is the example of Prime Minister Narendra Modi talking about how sometime in the sort of distant past, there must have been a plastic surgeon who, for whatever unknown reasons, decided to graft an elephant's head onto a human body, which is the embodiment of Lord Ganesha, a human with an elephant's head. And he suggested that this shows somehow that Hindu mythological beliefs have sort of this tie-in to modern science. And as Subramaniam sort of tongue-in-cheek jests, even gods need doctors. So you can see there on the right a sort of classic example of a pose of Ganesha. But the story we're getting from Narendra Modi and others would make us think that we should be thinking about something more like this, basically an elephant-ish human, which we know is nonsense. Now, Subramaniam draws an important contrast between Christian and Hindu views on science in her article, noting that unlike many Christian fundamentalists who are strongly anti-science, Hindus largely embrace science, even if they do it through kind of a Vedic tinted sort of lens. And she argues, indeed, India has embraced scientific epidemiology and followed global protocols, often more vigorously than other nations. The very fact that India is one of the main centers of producing viruses for several companies is a good testament to that. But she also argues, and this is key, she suggests, that modern science is not all that constitutes quote-unquote science in contemporary India. In addition to global scientific protocols, the Indian government and Indian popular culture have enthusiastically promoted Vedic science as modern science. And she notes that this constant blurring of the boundaries between ancient Vedic science and modern science is significant in the circulation and consolidation of Hindu nationalism in these corona times. And she argues that these dual kind of systems, Vedic and Western science, could actually work together, and the Vedic sciences actually have a very long and rich history that we can learn a lot from and which can inform sort of Western science and medicine. But unfortunately, the way Vedic science is being used by Hindu nationalists, basically, they're advancing all of these non-scientific claims, but trying to wrap them in the veneer of Vedic science to make them seem more legitimate. So as she argues, Hindu nationalists have reduced Vedic science to a handmaiden to Western medical systems of knowledge, a facile system compatible to the aspirations of a neoliberal and increasingly corporatized state, which fit squarely with kind of the broader political and economic agendas of Modi's BJP party. Now, she also echoed some of the same concerns we heard from Nelson about how Hindu nationalists are targeting Muslims during the lockdown and scapegoating Muslims and even Chinese in some cases for spreading the virus. And these are kind of the same social cleavages that Nelson discussed and also that Juergensmeyer got into in our earlier readings. So one of the things she mentioned, so when she was writing an article in the fall of 2020, we hadn't seen the big outbreaks in the spring of 2021 that took place in India. And one of the things she talks about is how Modi's popularity remained really high, even despite the outbreak of the virus, and that seemed to have been strong throughout all of 2020. But what we see is by 2021, that started to change, particularly in the spring, when the outbreak really exploded in India. So you can see chart here updated as of July 8th, 2021, looking at the approval rating of different political leaders around the world, this one for Narendra Modi. And you can see very clearly Modi had a near 80% or high 75% approval rating throughout the fall of 19 into most of 2020 and early 2021. Began to drop a little bit sometime in the summerish period of 2020, but not really significantly. And it was really there when you start to get into March and then really April and May, when the major part of the outbreaks were really ravaging India, that you see a significant drop occurring both in Modi's approval rating and a spike in the disapproval rating, hitting about 32% in May of this year, and it's dropped down a little bit. But that gives us some indication that although it seemed like Modi's popularity was essentially untouchable, finally, as the pandemic began to really spread and take hold, the incompetence of the Indian government became more and more clear to more people. And just to kind of give you some context, so here's looking at about a dozen other political leaders and their approval rating from January 2020 up until July 8th, 2021. And what you'll notice is two important things. One, Modi remains one of the few political leaders that stayed above 50% for most of the period. It was really only until that outbreak in April and May that he dropped below 50% approval rating. But also that Mexico and Brazil had the next two highest approval ratings for most of that period. Now, interestingly, Mexico, Manuel Lopez Obrador, stayed relatively stable across this whole period in terms of his public support. By contrast, somewhere in Brazil, like you've got Jair Bolsonaro, started out relatively significant. I believe it was around 20 or so percent public support back in January of 2020. But by the time you get to July of 2021, his support has actually dropped down into roughly negative 20%. In large part due to the failure of Brazil to respond to the crisis and his sort of denial of COVID as being a real problem. So you can see kind of the way that COVID has not only brought down public approval ratings in general, but also has been an important factor in how political regimes have kind of negotiated this period and with their supporters and potential opponents. Now, super medium reminds us that part of Modi's really continued high appeal is precisely that he's been able to draw support from this kind of broad Hindu nationalism, which has deep roots, as she notes, in affluent, educated, and urban citizens, many of whom benefited from the initial 4-hour lockdown, sort of 4-hour notification in advance of the lockdown in 2020. As well as other various efforts since then. And it's really been the poor and the marginalized, including Dalit caste Hindus and Muslims, who really faced the brunt of the government failures. And so she suggests that the blurring boundaries of science and pseudoscience in India is really made possible by this broader kind of Hindu nationalism, which include things like the symbolic offering and drinking of sacred cow urine and the Gamutra, to worshiping of new religious deities such as Coronil. And as she notes, even the Ministry of Ayush, which was one of the kind of ayurvedic ministries that Modi set up in the last few years, has issued various advisories during the pandemic that included dubious prevention measures and prophylactics to the virus, such as using cow urine, ginger, and turmeric. And as she notes, government officials and many other spokesmen have advocated and circulated lots of kind of slick ads and infographics and social media content that plays up many of these bogus, Vedic medical cures. Baba Ramdev being kind of a classic example of this through his company and through the creation of Coronil and Swasari ayurvedic cures for COVID-19. Both of which have been rejected by kind of the Indian medical community as being legitimate cures. But just to kind of give you a sense of some of these debates taking place in India, here's a little clip looking at some of these political debates involving Baba Ram and COVID-19.
This yoga guru's comments on modern medicine have outraged Indians on and offline.
लाखों लोगों की मौत एलोपैथी की दवा खाने से हुई है। जितने लोगों की मौत हॉस्पिटल न जाने के कारण से हुई है, ऑक्सीजन न मिलने के कारण से हुई है, उससे ज्यादा लोगों की मौत ऑक्सीजन के बावजूद हुई है, दवा एलोपैथी की दवा मिलने के बावजूद हुई है।
Baba Ramdev has quite a following on social media, but it's not the first time people are shaking their heads at his remarks.
Ramdev has a reputation for making controversial, unscientific remarks. Earlier, he had mocked COVID patients looking for oxygen cylinders, and his most recent comments have now caused a huge outcry, especially from the medical community, which is still battling a ferocious second wave of infections.
The yogi withdrew his comments after criticism by India's health minister, and the Indian Medical Association is urging Prime Minister Modi to stop the misinformation campaign on vaccination by Mr. Ramdev. The yoga guru has also advertised a supposed COVID-19 cure among a whole range of other ayurvedic products. Marketing Coronil as a COVID-19 remedy had to stop last year when the government said there is no data to prove it works. But recently, the state of Haryana announced they distribute the product for free to COVID patients.
Doctors are speaking out against this move, saying this sends the wrong message about how to treat COVID-19. This is especially dangerous at a time when the disease is spreading fast in rural areas where there are extremely limited healthcare facilities and misinformation and myths abound.
In rural areas, many are hesitant to get vaccinated for fear of negative side effects.
आमच्या गावातले गावातून 3 माणसांनी लस घेतलेली आहे. दुसरी माणसं घाबरतात लस घेण्यासाठी, म्हणजे असं लस घेतल्यावर काही म्हणजे माणसं मरतात काय असं त्यांचा गैरसमज होतं.
It is about 1 lakh people for people staying in this 25 villages. The vaccination center or camp which was put on for these 1 lakh people, no single person came from this 1 lakh and took the vaccination.
Hesitancy is only one factor hampering vaccination efforts. Medical facilities providing vaccines are often scarce, with the closest hospitals hours away. And only about half of India's population has internet access, making vaccination appointments hard to come by for many.
So it gives you a little bit of sense of some of the context there of how some of these debates have been playing out, but also importantly some of the pushback that people like Baba Ramdev and others have gotten who are more accepting of kind of, let's say, secular science and government authorities, but are not necessarily sympathetic to the kind of BJP nationalism that we're seeing promoted in other cases. So as Subramaniam argues, this blurring of the boundaries between religion and science has really been central to Hindutva in general. And the mainstream political apparatus, media, and even the judiciaries have all been co-opted into unquestioned support for Hindu nationalism. In fact, she argues even opposition parties are afraid to embrace a secular agenda in India and instead promote a Hindutva light message. She says, we're seeing a brazen march towards a Hindu India with actions such as abrogating provisions of Article 370 that gave Kashmir special status, which we talked about earlier, and removing Article 35A from the Constitution that gave special rights and privilege to those in Kashmir. The recent Supreme Court verdict allowing the building of a temple in Ayodhya where the Babri Masjid or the Babri Mosque stood, which we also talked about, and the passing of the Citizens Amendment Act or the CAA that differentially targets and treats Muslim immigrants from neighboring countries. So here again, we hear some of these echoes that Nelson talked about in relation to broader South Asian trends, as well as some links back to themes in weeks 1 and 2, such as Hindu-Muslim tensions that led to communal violence in the 90s around Ayodhya and the destruction of the original mosque there, as well as the 2002 Gujarat massacres following the burning of Hindu pilgrims on a train coming back from Ayodhya. So Subramaniam notes that these modern medical technologies are being abused in order to target certain segments of the Indian population. Again, this is the biosurveillance we heard about earlier. Practices that have also been at work in Kashmir. So as she argues, this translated into poor neighborhoods and slums being more heavily surveilled as high risk, and people tracked if they moved between zones. And many of these high-risk, quote, red zones are in Muslim and Dalit neighborhoods. Thus, a public health tool was transformed into creating and enforcing ghettos of the sick. So as she argues more broadly, rather than bringing people together during the pandemic, religious nationalism in India has largely torn people, and particularly religious communities, apart. Okay, that wraps up our first part of the lecture for week 4. And we'll continue with part 2 of the lecture for week 4 in just a minute.